Hello, good morning. All right, folks. Well, it is 7:40, so we're going to get started here. Today we're going to be taking a look at the difference between capitalism and socialism. That's the main goal for today, and these are probably words that you've heard before. After the Industrial Revolution hits, which is the unit that we've been in this entire last couple weeks here, it's really the tail end of the unit. As the Industrial Revolution gets underway, new economic practices had been in place. And so I want to talk a little bit about what capitalism is first, and then talk about socialism as a reaction to capitalism and kind of the effects that extreme capitalism had on industrial society in the early 1800s, mid 1800s. And so I have let's see here. Let me pull this up. Get this ready to go for you. Let's do this. And we'll do this. And we'll do this. Something like this. All right, let me switch this over so you can see this. Actually, I'll do this really quick first. Where's my mouse? Okay, let me swap my camera over here to my desktop so you can see what I've set up here for you. We're going to be using this little chart here that I just made up on Paint to talk about the differences between capitalism and socialism. So on this side over here, let me make this larger. On this side, we'll be talking about, really? And then on this side over here, we'll be talking about socialism. Okay. So, all right, this is the chart that I'm going to use to get our way through what we're talking about today. And one of the main things that we have to understand about, where's my, here we go. Move this over here so I can see in case there's any comments. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to begin to understand what these terms mean and how they relate to the Industrial Revolution. So let's just start with that. Remember that the Industrial Revolution changed how economics are performed. Okay, they changed the system of economics in Europe and in America, and indeed around the entire globe. Okay, and when we talk about capitalism, you might recognize that word capital as being one of the main factors of production in the Industrial Revolution. Remember that what we were learning about at the start of the unit was that in order for any place to start industrializing, and Britain was the first to industrialize, there were certain prerequisites that needed to be met, okay? And those were land, labor, and capital. Those are the three factors of production that we talked about at the start of the unit. And there are land advantages, for example, that Britain had. They had certain natural resources like iron and coal. They also had plentiful riverways. They were an island. That was a land advantage because it served as a barrier for interference as they started to industrialize, so that Napoleon wasn't able to come over and invade England. So the water barriers were a help in their industrialization process. The riverways for transporting goods and the plentiful ports that they had around the globe with colonies around the planet on different continents, all the way over to Asia, all the way over to the Caribbean. And one of the things that we also need in order to begin to industrialize is capital, money, right? And when you watch that documentary, the previous economic system that really informed the practices of European colonizers was mercantilism. And we talked about what mercantilism is. Just as a brief reminder to you, I'll put it down over here in the corner. Mercantilism was the previous economic view. All right, and what mercantilism was based on was this idea that the amount of wealth on the globe was fixed, was finite, and that if we imagine to be the entire amount of money on the globe as being like a giant pie, we take and we divide up those pieces of the wealth between the various European nations that have varying degrees of wealth. And because everybody believed that there was just a fixed amount of wealth, everybody is competing for the largest piece of that pie that they can get their hands on, right? So here you can see how in this scenario, if the amount of pie is fixed, right, everybody has to compete with one another for the largest piece of that pie, all right? As we move over to a capitalist economic system, okay, as we move over to capitalism, we begin to understand that so long as businesses continue to grow and produce new goods and employ people, and those people get paid wages and stuff like that, the idea behind capitalism is that basically the amount of wealth a nation has can be infinitely produced. Okay? As opposed to mercantilism, which is that, wealth in mercantilism, wealth is finite, meaning it's limited, okay? All right? That everybody is competing for the same amount of wealth. Capitalism is when a nation realizes that the amount of wealth, you could have infinite numbers of pies. Okay, so you just keep on bringing out more and more and more pies as long as your economy continues to be productive. So you've got tons and tons and tons of pie. All right? And the reason you have so much of it is because new businesses are popping up. And those businesses are producing wealth. So capitalism really became the foundation of this new economic philosophy. And remember, we talked about Adam Smith. And one of the things that Adam Smith, who wrote a piece in the late 1700s called "The Wealth of Nations," Adam Smith talked about how capitalism, which is the current economic system that we still all have today, capitalism is kind of informed by this idea of liberty. Okay? And so when we think about capitalism, we also need to be thinking about the connection that capitalism has with liberty or freedom. Okay? Now, we generally look at the term liberty as being a good term. We like liberty. We like having freedoms. We like having individual choices. Okay? These are things that people value in their everyday lives, is the ability to be free. If we take freedom to an extreme, though, sometimes freedom can become a bad thing. And when it comes to the freedom associated with economics, so we think about liberty in different ways. We could have political liberty, we could have individual liberty, we could have economic liberty. There's different ways that we can think about liberty. When we think about liberty when it pertains to capitalism, economics, hey Gareth, when we think about liberty when it pertains to economics, if you take the economic system and you make it completely free, which is essentially the way that early industrialization worked, is that you had a completely free economy. What this resulted in over time is conditions becoming very extremized, okay? Conditions becoming very extreme economically, all right? What do I mean by that? Well, when I showed you the PowerPoint of the Industrial Revolution, all right, when I showed you the PowerPoint of the Industrial Revolution, we began talking about some of these things here. This is what economic liberty resulted in the Industrial Revolution, all right? It resulted in urban areas popping up that look something like this, okay? And you can see the amount of coal smoke and pollution that's going into the air. You can see the density of the living and how overpopulated the cities became. You can see the effects in the working conditions, where the working conditions were pretty miserable. All right. Here's another photograph of what unrestrained capitalism looks like. Unrestrained capitalism resulted in a pretty miserable existence, a very extreme existence for a whole lot of laborers. And remember that we also saw child labor, okay? We saw kids working in factories without even wearing shoes or something. You know, children working in factories. We saw workers revolting against the system, all right, because of the miserable existence that they had working 14 hours a day, 6 days a week in these factories where the Luddites came in and started smashing up machines and stuff like that, right? Here's another picture of workers in the 1800s, okay? But as industrialization grows, all right, we see some problems begin to emerge with capitalism, all right? We start to see some problems emerge with capitalism. Because one of the main problems that happens here, and I'm going to reference the PowerPoint really quickly, is that industrialization and capitalism, which is the foundation of industrialization, widened the gap between the industrialized rich, who made up an exceedingly smaller portion of the population, and non-industrialized poor nations. And this happened on a global level between nations like England and America and eventually Germany and other nations in Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and so on. Industrialized nations started to become increasingly wealthy, and non-industrialized nations of the planet became increasingly poor. But even on a local level, if we're looking at the populations of Britain, okay, or the populations of Germany, or the populations of the Netherlands and Belgium, and places that begin to industrialize, what we begin to see is that a increasingly smaller segment of these populations, okay, a smaller and smaller segment of the populations are really, really, really wealthy. And a larger segment of the population find themselves farther and farther and farther behind. All right? And this happens on a global level as well, where we see nations as a whole that are becoming increasingly poor comparative to the industrialized nations that are developing in Britain, okay, and across Europe. So let's talk a little bit about these terms here and begin to understand this widening gap between the wealthy and the poor parts of not only the populations of individual nations like Britain and America and so on, but also the wealth gap between industrialized nations and non-industrialized nations, okay? So when we talk about capitalism, okay, when we talk about capitalism, we have to understand a few basic principles. And I'm actually going to delete these pies that I made. Let's just do this. Delete that. Okay. And we're going to talk a little bit about Adam Smith. Adam Smith wrote a book called Wealth of Nations. Okay, Wealth of Nations. And in his book, Adam Smith defined the 3 laws of capitalism. So the first law of capitalism was the law of self-interest. Okay, the law of self-interest basically says that individuals will make rational decisions in the marketplace, all right, that benefit themselves. Law of self-interest. Individuals will make rational decisions in the marketplace that benefit themselves. And this is, again, based on this idea of freedom. All right? Freedom. That people should be free to make their own economic decisions. All right? That is one law of capitalism. And by allowing people to make individual decisions, rational decisions, they will make the best decisions in the long run for the economy. All right? Law number 2 is the law of competition. Okay? This basically says that when the economy is free, businesses will compete with each other to make the best goods at the lowest prices. All right, when the economy is free, businesses will compete with each other to make the best goods at the lowest prices. And the other reason that this was good is because it gives consumers more choices, freedom, in the marketplace. Okay? So let's say that you needed to buy an alarm clock. Okay? You needed to buy an alarm clock. There's tons and tons of companies around the planet that make alarm clocks. Okay? Tons of them. Tons of companies around the planet that make alarm clocks. The question in that scenario becomes how much do you want to spend on an alarm clock? Do you want the really fancy alarm clock that is tied into your entire house, Google Home or Amazon Alexa system? Do you want to just use the alarm clock on your phone, although the phone is expensive? So, or do you just need a bare minimum alarm clock that is plugged into the wall or runs on batteries, and you can buy it for $5 or $10 on Amazon? The law of competition allows for different businesses to compete with different segments of the economy to produce goods of varying value that people can afford. Let's say that you want to buy a car. How much money do you have? Some cars are built for kind of your working class population, where they're pretty cheap. They're not meant to run forever, but it'll get you from point A to point B. Or do you want to buy the Tesla, the electric car that costs $100,000, and you plug it into the wall and charge it, and you don't need to buy gas or whatever? Not everyone can afford a Tesla. In fact, I would say that probably most people cannot afford a Tesla. And so, law of competition allows for different companies to come into the marketplace and produce goods that people want to purchase. And maybe the people want to purchase goods that are cheap. Maybe the people want to purchase goods that are expensive. Either way, the law of competition allows for different companies to come in, compete with one another, make different goods, and allow people a lot of choices in the marketplace. Okay? And then the third law of competition, the third law of capitalism, according to Adam Smith, was the law of supply and demand. Sometimes this is referred to as the invisible hand. Okay? The idea behind Adam Smith and capitalism is that Adam Smith believed in something called laissez-faire economics. In other words, the government should interfere as little as possible in the economy, and the economy should be free. Okay? And he argued that the law of supply and demand would make it so that when we think about supply is the amount of a good or resource, okay, available, all right, the amount of a good or resource available. The demand is how much people want a good, okay? How much people want a good or service, because capitalism also applies to services like, construction or lawn services or other things like that, okay? So how much people want a good or service, all right? And the price of a good or service, it will be naturally determined by the supply and the demand for a good. So think about it this way. Let's take diamonds. All right? The supply of diamonds is scarce. Okay? There are not a lot of diamonds in circulation. That's manufactured scarcity, by the way. There are actually tons of diamonds, but they only release a few every year. The point being, though, that because diamonds are kept in scarce supply, that keeps the price of them artificially high. Why are diamonds in demand? Because if you plan on getting married, all right, if you plan on getting married and you give your fiance a ring that does not have a diamond in it, that is probably not going to be a good thing, because they're probably not going to be happy with any rock that isn't a diamond. All right? Now, I'm not saying that, I think we're moving into a time we're starting to look at, I think we're starting to move into a time where maybe people are starting to realize, like, some of the silliness surrounding buying expensive rocks for the purposes of relationships. I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe we're not moving there yet, and I'm just out of touch. But maybe in an ideal world, of course, it shouldn't matter what kind of stone that you put into an engagement ring, but the industry standard is diamonds. And so for anyone who's getting married, and lots of people are getting married, they're getting married once, they're getting divorced, they're getting married twice, they're getting divorced. People get married all the time, but if you're planning on getting married, probably you're going to need to buy a diamond, right? So that keeps the demand of diamonds relatively high. And that means that the price of diamonds will be determined by the supply and demand for a good. But already we have problems with this scenario. And we can look at diamonds as exactly problematic as to why this philosophy can sometimes be undermined by freedom. The government isn't what determines the amount of supply of diamonds. Governments don't determine the amount of diamonds that are going to be mined. Governments don't determine the amount of diamonds that are available on the planet. Governments don't determine the cost of diamonds. Companies do that. Private companies do that, okay? And what we saw happen in the situation with diamonds is that private companies like the De Beers Diamond Cartel went into places, set up mining operations, began extracting diamonds in massive amounts, and then started hoarding those diamonds. This is a private company doing this. And already we realize that in order for problems to begin occurring in the marketplace, we don't need governments to do that. Private companies are plenty good at creating problems in the marketplace on their own. All right, and there are several different other examples of this. Take news media corporations. In the last 40 years, the United States has passed a number of laws that have deregulated the economy and allowed private companies to be able to accrue massive amounts of wealth and power. Are the companies run by the government? No, they're private, okay? The companies are not run by the government. The companies are private. Okay, they are private companies, all right? When we say private, okay, when we talk about private, we are saying that it is owned by a person or a group of people, okay, who are they're not government workers, they're just They're just business people, okay? And so one of the things that we start to see happen with companies during the Industrial Revolution is that companies start, you have to understand, okay? You have to understand that when we look at companies, companies have one goal. Companies have one goal. What do you imagine the goal of a private company is? You can sum it up in a single word. Anyone have any idea what the main goal of every single private company is? What do you suppose the goal that everyone has exactly? Okay, money. All right? Private companies are interested in exactly one thing. Yes, profit. Okay? Profit. Thank you so much. Nice job. All right. You guys are on the same page as me. Very good. All right. Because companies are motivated primarily by profit, all right, we have to understand that companies are going to make decisions to maximize their profit. Companies are going to make decisions that maximize their profit. Well, what do you mean, Mr. Knight? Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what companies will do to maximize their profit. Private companies will do things like, okay, they will, Max, pull this out here, okay, they will pay workers as little as they can get away with, okay, they will cut corners in production to reduce costs, they will go to places around the planet to extract raw materials for the cheapest price. Okay, they will, they will sell goods for as much as people will buy them for, okay, and so on. Companies make these kinds of decisions all the time, and we see it today every single day, okay, every single day. Companies do this all the time. And what you have to understand is that when companies who are really good at maximizing profit get really, really wealthy, what they then can do is start buying out other businesses who compete with them. Okay? And this is particularly concerning. Right, at least the owners of the companies. But that's one of the main problems, Gareth, is that most people are not owners of companies, they are workers at the companies. Now, look, I'm not trying to completely trash capitalism here, but I am trying to have a balanced conversation here about capitalism. All right, and what sometimes capitalism results in if you have too much freedom. And that's really what I'm trying to get back here around. If the government doesn't make any laws, if the government completely stays out of the economy and doesn't regulate businesses, if there's no oversight over businesses, which there was very, very little oversight over businesses in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. What we began to see happen very quickly is that we saw this gap start to develop between the very small number of people who had huge companies and massive amounts of wealth, and the rest of society who were all kind of sucked into this system as laborers who have relatively little wealth to share between them. So huge numbers of people with very little wealth to share between them, and very, very, very tiny numbers of people who have massive amounts of wealth between them. All right. But so you guys are already getting heated, I can see here. Companies were made with the sole purpose of money because no one wants to live in poverty and they want to experience the world to the fullest. Yes. Companies should be to serve the people, not get some paper. Sure, I guess right now money is the currency, but everything that is booming is to help serve humanity. Well, it should be, at least. I mean, that's what we hope. We hope companies want to do something to serve humanity and offer, goods and services to people that will help people out. Of course, that's what we want companies to do. But the only way companies are going to do that is if at the end of the day there's money to be made on it. Companies who solely look at the needs of the people tend not to do very well. All right? So, why am I talking about all of this stuff? Well, I want to talk about going back to that idea of diamonds, okay? Because there were no government regulations on the diamond companies, what the diamond companies were able to do in order to maximize their profit, okay? The diamond companies began hoarding diamonds. And what that allowed the diamond companies to do is essentially to create what's known as a monopoly. Perhaps you've ever heard of the term monopoly before, okay? A monopoly is when a company becomes so wealthy they are the only source of a good or service and have no competitors in the marketplace. Okay? No competitors in the marketplace. So when a company becomes so wealthy that they're the only source of a good or service and have no competitors in the marketplace, this becomes problematic. Because now you have a situation where you have essentially allowed freedom, in the name of freedom, you've allowed these businesses to become so wealthy and so powerful that they're literally able to control all of a particular good or service. All right? All right. So that's what a monopoly is. Think about it. Mono, one, right? And the idea being here that one company is able, for example, with diamonds, okay, one company is able to have a profound impact on the number of diamonds in circulation, the price that those diamonds are that they cost, the cost of the diamonds, okay, or the price that they're sold for. These contribute to long-term problems in the marketplace. So when we think about the types of things that we're talking about today, we very much have to think of it as existing along a spectrum. Okay, where all the way on one side of the spectrum, okay, let's say over on this side, okay, all the way over on one side of the spectrum, you have capitalism, okay, and all the way over on the other side of the spectrum, you have socialism. All right? So when we think about where countries are in terms of how they fall on this line here, there are some countries that are much more capitalistic, and they'd be farther on this side of the spectrum. And then there's other countries that are much more socialist, and they fall somewhere on that side of the spectrum. But for the most part, countries fall somewhere in between. Okay, some countries are a little bit closer to being more free in their economies. Some countries are a little bit more closer to being less free in their economies. All right, so we could point out any number of different countries on here, like if we go back to the Soviet Union, back when Russia was communist when I was a kid. Okay, they were really, really, really far right. They were so far socialist, they actually became a different thing called communist. Okay, and then there are other nations like America that are going to be pushing more towards the capitalist side of things. All right? So we have to understand that when we're talking about these terms, it's not really a country is only capitalist or only socialist. They fall somewhere in between. Okay? China is more socialist. China is more socialist. Although that's a tricky one, because China has recently been freeing up their economy a little bit more, but because China's government is communist and there's only one party rule, we generally think of China's government as being much more heavy-handed in the economy. So China is going to be more towards the socialist side of things. All right? But again, it kind of depends a little bit on how you're looking at it. But China is a tricky one. But generally, I would say that they are more socialist, okay? Because their government has a whole lot of power and influence because it's a single-party government, okay? Generally speaking, capitalist nations have a tendency to be more democratic, okay? This is generally speaking here. Capitalist nations have a tendency to be more democratic, and socialist nations have a tendency to be more, authoritarian. Okay. Let's see here. What kind of a country is China? Is China a good country? China's a good country. Sure, China's a good country in some ways, but China's a bad country in other ways. It just kind of depends on how you're looking at it. China is essential for America. America needs China because China provides a lot of labor. China has a lot of people, so they have a lot of workers. Okay, so they provide a lot of labor for American companies. China also means because they have a lot of people, they have a lot of consumers, which means that China is good for America because there's a lot of people who purchase American goods in China. Okay, so in that sense, China's a good country. But there are other ways in China that China is not a good country. China's not a good country because they don't have a very good track record with human rights. China is not very free. So in other words, politically especially, people have very few freedoms in China. Probably I wouldn't even, if we were in China right now, I wouldn't even be allowed to give this lecture. Okay? Because, at the end of the day, there's a lot of regulations in China that prevent freedom from being able to happen. All right? And so the government has a lot of control over what's taught in schools. The government has a lot of control over what people believe. Okay? And these are things that here in America we generally would look at as bad. Okay? Also China with their human rights record isn't very good. There's been a lot of times in Chinese history, all the way up and through modern day times, where you have, for example, Muslim populations in China that are being treated extremely brutally right now, and so on and so forth. So China has good aspects to them, but they also have bad aspects to them. All right. So let's continue talking here a little bit more about capitalism. And when we look at this chart here, let's begin to start filling this chart out. Okay, well, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, the definition of capitalism. Let's take a look at capitalism and define it. Capitalism is an economic system that values individual freedom, reducing government interference in the economy, and promotes competition. Under the belief that a free economy will produce endless wealth. Okay? So that's essential. I just made that definition up off of the top of my head. But it's an economic system that values individual freedom, reducing government interference in the economy, meaning deregulating the economy, and promotes competition between businesses under the belief that a free economy will produce endless wealth. Okay? So we believe that in a capitalist economy, once again, that the amount of wealth a nation has can be infinitely produced. All right? And this will cause capitalist nations to become extraordinarily wealthy. Arnav, wait, Mr. Knight, in socialism, the government decides how much money you get and stuff, right? I think you're thinking more communism. Okay? That's more communism. Communism is the most extreme version of socialism. Communism is where there is no freedom at all anymore in the marketplace. All right? And the point that I was trying to make to you is this, guys. The point that I was trying to make is this. If we're over here all the way to one side, okay, or if we're over here all the way to one side, both of them result in bad things happening. Okay? That was kind of the point that I was trying to make, is when we think about these terms, capitalism and socialism, if you go all the way to one extreme over here and have total freedom of the marketplace and no government regulation at all, that's a bad thing. If we move all the way over to the other side and we have total regulation of the economy and no freedom, that also is a bad thing. Okay, so we want to try to avoid going to the extremes on either side, because as we have seen throughout history, the extremes on either side result in bad things happening. Well, Arnav, going back to what I was talking to you about, total freedom of the economy, okay, results in this, monopolies, okay? People abuse it. He's right, okay? When we talk about total freedom in the marketplace, it results in bad things happening. Monopolies start to take place where competition is cut down, okay? Look at the news media corporations. That's another example of it that I was going to mention earlier. News media corporations have why do we have a problem with fake news today? Why do we have a problem with fake news today? It's because media corporations are about one thing. They're about the same thing that all other companies are about. They're about making money, okay? They're maximizing their profit. So what happens is people are fed the news through these organizations that are able to essentially determine whatever they think is news and feed it to the people. All right? Now, that's not true in all cases. There are some news media organizations that are still, viable. But for the most part, any major news media corporation, whether we're looking at Fox or MSNBC or OAN or CNN or whatever news media organization that we're looking at, all right, they determine the news that they're going to tell, and that's based on the viewership. Okay, now, just because of that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the news is wrong. Okay, listen to me though. Listen, because there is a caveat here. Okay, it's not all fake news. Again, Arnav, you need to not go to the extremes. All right, the world is not black and white. All right, the world is not just to one side or the other. All right, the trick with modern day news is finding the news that is accurate, okay? Because it's not all fake, and that's the thing, all right? Not all news is fake, all right? There is some news that is very, very real and has serious implications, all right? Take, for example, the confirmation of the new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, or whatever her name is, okay? That's real news. That happened, okay? It's not fake. It happened, all right? And the fact that it happened has serious implications for our government, okay? It has serious implications for the people in our nation, all right? Not fake news. It happened, and it's going to potentially cause issues down the line, all right? It's pretty much unprecedented. I mean, what we saw happen yesterday with the confirmation of this new Supreme Court justice, they rushed her through that so fast it would make anyone's head spin. And they did it just 5 days before the election, okay? And so again, this has, and if I take you back 4 years to 2016, there was, a Supreme Court justice that was nominated by President Obama, who, a full year before the election took place, and the Senate Republicans blocked that, right? They said, no, the people in an election year should determine the next Supreme Court justice. We shouldn't be rushing through Supreme Court justices in an election year, because people should have the right to have a say in the president's nomination. But this time, since it was them in power, they didn't do that. They rushed it through, and they went back on all of the things that they said 4 years ago when Obama was trying to get a Supreme Court justice nominated to the court in the final year of his presidency, his second term. All right? And so, these news stories are real, guys. They're not fake. They are actually happening. Okay? The problem though is the extent to which the news is extremized. All right? The extent to which the news is extremized. There are certain news organizations. Let's take Vice as an example. All right? Vice News, which talks about a lot of controversial things, but Vice News is very, 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 very what we might call leftist or liberal. Okay? And so the kinds of stories that Vice News reports on are going to appeal to their audience who already follows them. All right? Is it fake? No, it's not fake. All right? It's just that the news that people are being told, all right, is news that probably they're going to is news that they're probably going to be receptive to. Okay? It doesn't mean that the news is itself fake. The news is it could be real, okay? But because it's being provided by a particular news outlet, only some people are going to be exposed to it. All right? And that's a problem, because if news stories that are important because they're real only reach some segments of the population, that means that other segments of the population are going to not listen to that news source simply because of the source that it came from. All right? You have to realize reporters only report what they're told, and the 5 or some corporations that run the news that you see on TV can tell you what they please. Okay, sure. Yeah, absolutely. All right? Absolutely. But if we're talking about the 5 major corporations, let's say Fox, NBC, CNN, etc. Okay, Disney owns a lot of news stations as well. You're absolutely right, Gareth. Okay, I think, I don't know how it is. I don't know if it's Disney owns NBC or NBC owns Disney or something like that. All right. So news corporation, news corporations are going to, what news are you going to see? I'll tell you what news you're going to see. It's not the 1% of news you need to know. It's the news that you already subscribe to. I think we need to understand, Arnav, that the problem doesn't solely rest with the news organizations. The problem rests even-handedly with society subscribing to, a particular news station. So if the only news station that you perceive to be accurate is Fox News, and you refuse to watch anything but Fox News, you are going to come out of that experience with a very radicalized view of the world, all right? Because the news can be presented in ways that very subtly pull you to the extremes of whatever belief system you have, all right? So we can't solely blame the news corporations. The news corporations are in some sense extremely predictable, all right? I'm really not. In fact, the point I was just going to make is the news organizations, of course they're going to be trying to make money. That's what all organizations do. Right. Okay, Arnav, if they don't care about your knowledge, let me go back to the point that I was originally trying to make. If they don't care about your knowledge, all right, if they care, number one, about their money, about their profits, all right, that is because in our country, they have the freedom to be able to do that, okay? The economic freedoms given to news organizations mean that they are always going to value their profits, okay? Now, there is something known as journalistic integrity, and I think that there are some reporters on various news stations that do have integrity as they deliver the news, okay? And they do so in an even-handed fashion that is not attempting to push some sort of agenda on people. I do think that those kinds of news reporters exist. Those kinds of news reporters, though, are not going to be people like Anderson Cooper. They're not going to be people like, Sean Hannity. They're not going to be people who have 1-hour news shows, quote-unquote news shows, which are really entertainment shows, okay, where they get on and they talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, okay? All right? And they yell. Basically, they yell, all right? And so, there are certain, I'm telling you, man, there are certain people who have integrity when they deliver the news, So anyhow, all right, let's keep moving forward here. The point that I'm trying to make to you all right, is that when companies, private companies, whether they're news media companies, whether they're diamond companies, whatever company they are, if they're given too much freedom to operate however they want, we are going to see consumers of the goods and services that these companies provide. Again, whether it's goods like diamonds or services like the news, if companies are given too much freedom, what's going to happen? People will suffer as a result. Okay? People will suffer as a result. And this goes back to Adam Smith's law of self-interest. Okay? We believe, according to Adam Smith, that individuals make rational decisions in the marketplace that benefit themselves. But we have to question the extent to which your everyday common person truly acts in a manner in which is rational for themselves. I would say that some people would say, oh, it's a good thing that these news corporations are given freedom because I am free to choose the news that I want to watch. Okay? I'm free to choose the news that I want to watch. The problem with that is that in the choice of being free to watch the news that they want to watch, okay, the very desire of wanting something is itself irrational a lot of times. Guys, I would love to have a Ferrari, okay? I want one, sure. I want a Ferrari really bad, okay? But that's not a rational decision, okay? Me wanting a Ferrari, okay, does not mean that me going out and buying a Ferrari is a rational decision, all right? And that's one of the major problems that you have, all right? That's one of the major problems that you have. News should be free to the people. People should be informed. The problem is that these news corporations in recent times have created a situation where the only way that people are informed is by picking and choosing news that reinforces their already existing beliefs, which in many cases are wrong. Okay? Many people's beliefs about things are flat out wrong. Okay? They're just not based in reality. But if they continue to watch news sources that reinforce those beliefs, that becomes a problem. And the news companies are laughing all the way to the bank as they make money on advertising, as they make money on all sorts of different avenues of wealth that come out of delivering the news. All right? So, we need to be very skeptical. My whole point here, Arnav, all right? My whole point here, and to the rest of you, okay? My whole point is to simply say that if we go all the way over here, okay, all the way over here to this extreme, and we have complete freedom in the marketplace, companies start to prey on people, okay? Companies start to prey on people. And again, we've been focusing our conversation around news media, but let's take another one. Banks. Okay, banks prey on people all the time. They give out, if you don't have regulations on banks, this is what happened. You guys probably are too young to remember this. In the early 2000s, there was a giant recession when you guys were very, very, very little. All right? In the early 2000s, there was a recession. And the reason that there was a recession in the early 2000s is because during the Bush administration, Bush deregulated the banks. And what happened with the banks is when the banks were deregulated, they were able to give out loans to people that they knew they couldn't pay back. And so what happened was the banks were giving out loans left and right to people for them to buy property. You might think this is a good thing because people think to themselves, I want a house. I want 2 houses. I want 4 houses. People were going out and buying houses with money they did not have. And the banks, because the banks are trying to make money, all right, they were more than willing to give those loans out at extremely high interest rates. But of course, what happens if you give a loan out to people? All right, what happens if you give a loan out to people that they are not able to pay back? Well, what happens is the Great Recession of the early 2000s, where banks begin taking people's houses from them because the banks repossess your property when you stop paying your mortgage. All right, so it happens in all industries, and it happened in the meatpacking industry in the early 1900s. The meatpacking industry, because it had no government regulations, okay, the government prints the money, but it's not just them printing it because they want to. And no, they can't just print more money, okay? It doesn't work like that. It just doesn't work like that. It's a complex answer to that, but that's not a rational or feasible solution, okay? But the point that I was trying to make here, yeah, exactly. It would bring the value of the money down, and that would cause inflation. We don't want inflation, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so it's not going to work. But the point that I was going to make here, folks, is that in the meatpacking industry in the early 1900s, okay, there were no regulations to the meatpacking industry. People would go and buy, like, let's say, whatever, hamburger ground meat at the grocery store. They'd find broken off knife blades in it, okay? The sanitary conditions were miserable. People were getting sick from eating the meat because people weren't washing their hands, and it wasn't being managed in a proper way. Okay, and you might think, oh, well, if the companies are good, then what will happen in a free market is people will stop buying bad meat. Okay, people will stop buying bad meat. That company will go out of business, and then another company will replace them. Okay, here's the problem with that. It all comes down to price. People will pay for what they can afford. All right. And if the only thing you can afford is the cheap meat, okay, and enough people continue to buy the cheap meat, that company's not going anywhere. Look at Walmart, okay? Walmart is the quintessential example of a company who will move into a place, drop all of their prices extraordinarily low, treat their workers terrible, cut their hours, not give them insurance policies, all of these other things. And over time, over time, what happens is Walmart puts all the other businesses out of business. So before long, if you're living in wherever, Bohunk, Alabama, and the only store that you have to go to in your entire community is Walmart, Walmart's not going anywhere because, once again, you've effectively created a local monopoly. Right? Because now there are no other choices. Now if you want something, the only place that you can go and buy it is Walmart. And sure, it'll be for dirt low prices, but does that really benefit you in the long run? In the long run, what that does is it creates more Walmarts, which puts more places out of business, and creates an even further extension of their monopoly. And that's problematic. It's problematic, and it makes it so that people think, even if you have other choices, if you're poor and you have the choice of going and buying your groceries at Walmart or going and buying your groceries at Vons, you're going to choose Walmart every day of the week because poor people love Walmart because their prices are low. And when people don't have a lot of money to share between them, they go and they rationally, quote unquote, make the decision to pay the least amount for a good as they can. Let's say you need to buy some Windex, okay? You can go and buy Windex for $4 a bottle at Vons, or you can go to Walmart and buy it for $1.75. People are going to pick Walmart every day of the week because they don't have a lot of money. Unbeknownst to them, though, they are very much contributing to the very conditions that will extend the poverty of other people. Because the more Walmarts that pop up, the less opportunities people have in other businesses. Okay? Because Walmart puts other businesses out of business. All right? So people think they're making rational decisions a lot, when really they're making decisions in the long run that are going to undermine the viability of their economic status in society. What do I think the solution is? Well, I don't have the solution, guys. I'm just a teacher, okay? I'm just some guy who sits around and thinks about this stuff every day, all right? But I would say that we need a healthy balance of freedom in the marketplace, where people have choices, where people can go and make decisions for themselves, where people have opportunities, but not so much freedom in the marketplace that it creates these massive, massive corporations that actually, in the long run, end up taking opportunities away from people rather than affording them opportunities. It's about finding a healthy balance. And we have to understand, too, that even here in the United States may be leaning more capitalist than socialist. But I need to remind you that even here in the United States, we have institutions that are socialized. All socialism is all socialism is when the government, okay, here, let's talk about socialism. Socialism is when let me put it in black lettering here. When the government steps in to begin creating segments of the economy that are paid for by tax dollars for the benefit of individuals. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about this. What we begin to understand regulating aspects of the private economy. Okay. So, so folks, all right, let's focus here, okay? Because I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about this, and we're going to have to continue this lecture on Wednesday. We'll probably be testing on Friday here for this, okay? So please focus on this next section here where we talk about socialism, okay? Socialism comes out, we need to understand socialism as people's lives in the Industrial Revolution became exceedingly bleak and difficult, the reaction of the poorer segments of the population was to pressure the government to step in and advocate on behalf of the people whose lives were miserable. Sure, I can do that. Okay, I'll save this after I get done doing it today, and I'll post it on Canvas for you. Okay. As people's lives in the Industrial Revolution became exceedingly bleak and difficult, the reaction of the poorer segments of the population was to pressure the government to step in and advocate on behalf of the people whose lives were miserable. We have to ask ourselves a simple question. Why does the government exist? Okay, what is the purpose of the government? All right, and a lot of people are very suspicious of the government, going all the way back to tyranny of the American Revolution. People don't like the idea of a government that is too powerful. However, I want to remind you that you need a powerful enough government to be able to create laws, rules of both, not just criminal laws, but also laws that make it so that private companies and individuals are benefiting society. The purpose of government, ostensibly, the purpose of government is to serve the people. You don't want a government that is like a corporation. You don't want a government that is a business. Because if a government is a business, then what's their number one motivation again? Profit. You want a government that prioritizes people, okay? That prioritizes society, that prioritizes creating conditions that allow humanity to thrive, okay? You do not want a government whose only purpose is to act like a tyrant, okay, control the lives of people, rob people through taxation or something like that. That you don't want that kind of government, but you do want a government that is strong enough to serve as a check against companies. Well, Arnav, I would say once again, we want to probably we want to avoid thinking in concrete terms, okay? Because although the government does establish certain controls on society, there are also ways in which those controls are absolutely necessary. And I can point to, for example, look at pollution laws, all right? You want a government that's able to step in and say, look, these companies are destroying the environment. We need to make it a law that companies cannot just dump their toxic waste into rivers, okay? That's a control. Yes, it's a control. And yes, it's inconvenient for companies to have to properly dispose of toxic waste. All right? Yeah, it's an inconvenience. Yeah, it's going to cost them money. But guess what? The reason that we pass laws like that is precisely because of what I was talking about, which is that ostensibly the government is there to create a better society. It's to make it so that people don't have to live in complete pollution and squalor. All right? That's why we have a government. So yes, the government does try to control things, but they're trying to control things, hopefully, in a way in which improves the lives of the people who live under that government. That's why we should have a government in the first place. The point of government is to serve the people first, not companies first. All right? So that's the whole idea that we're trying to move towards here. Now, what do we mean when we say socialism? Okay, socialism. Socialized government programs are paid for by tax dollars. These are what we know as public, okay, public services. All right, public services. Capitalism values private services, goods and services. Okay? All right. So, newsflash, okay? You guys are receiving an education right now. If it were any other year, we would be sitting in the classroom wrapping up our class right now. All right? But you'd be sitting in a school paid for by tax dollars. Why are people willing to build schools with tax dollars? Schools are not there for profit. Schools are not there to, to expand and make money as a private company. Schools are there to educate kids. That's why schools exist. And because people believe that having an educated population is important, that means that they are willing to pay tax dollars to fund schools. Schools are government institutions, all right? Why do we have them? Because people agree with the policy of paying for educating the youthful generation. You know? That's why people pay for schools. Schools are not companies. They're government organizations paid for by tax dollars. In that sense, schools are socialist, okay? Minimally, they are socialized, okay? When we say socialized, what we are saying is that this is a service provided to the people, which is quote-unquote free of charge. It's not really free of charge because you pay for it with your tax dollars, okay? But it's free of charge in the sense that when you show up to school at the start of the school year, you don't have to pay tuition to go to school. Anyone from any segment of society is mandated, legally required to go to school. Okay, well, I understand that there are aspects of the school that are business and so on, and fundraisers and all that sort of thing, but they're not a business in the traditional sense of the term. Okay, they are paid for by tax dollars. And there are other services like this as well. All right, there are other services, government services like this as well. The post office is another one. How does the post office function? It functions on tax dollars. Why do we have a post office? Because you should be able to reliably send things throughout the country for a relatively cheap cost. Okay? the Postal Service, police and fire services. As you guys probably saw, there are a bunch of fires breaking out. Who pays for police and fire services? The people do. The people pay for police and fire services, okay? When you call up the police, if somebody breaks into your house, they don't get on the phone with you and give you a quote as though you're going to replace your roof, okay? They're not going to say, oh, well, due to this, that, the other, we're going to charge you this much to come out to your house in your neighborhood and deal with this big of an issue, all right? They come out to your house because they are required to come out to your house, all right? They're paid for by the public. School is mandatory. You got to go to get a job, which they don't have money back, so you got to get it. It's a salary, pay for your house, so it is a business. I think that you're going way off on a tangent there, man. School's mandatory because you want people to be educated and not make stupid decisions. School's mandatory so that you go into the world as an adult and you don't show up at the voting booths and make dumb decisions. That's why schools are in place, okay? The money does not go to the colleges, it goes to the private colleges. There's all sorts of arguments. The college side of things is a little different than the public schools, okay? But either way, kids, I have exhausted my time, so we are going to have to continue this conversation on Wednesday, all right? But we will pick it up talking more about capitalism versus socialism on Wednesday and finish up this discussion. And when I get done with this thing, filling this whole thing out for you guys, then we will I'll post it on Canvas so that you can use it to study for the test on Friday. All right, folks. Hey, I just want to say thanks so much for tuning in. I hope that you learned a few things today, and we'll be continuing this discussion on Wednesday. Have a great rest of the day.